This is a co-work with my friend Chinen Wu of Academia Sinica of Taiwan, and the Chinen has provided the Asia Barometer survey data, but everything is written by myself, and then followed my logical thinking. So if there is a criticism and fault, all responsibilities fall to myself, not to him. All right, so let me begin my research. In this project, we are talking a lot about economic power and then military power of not rising, it's already China is a recent great power in Asia-Pacific region, but usually we regard China as a parameter while neglecting Asian countries themselves. But I guess the power is can be understood in an interactive perspective. So in that matter, especially from the perspective of the social power or soft power or whatever you term, I would like to check how the East Asian views on the increasing Chinese influence. Okay. Okay. We all know that China has come to enjoy her sticky power with the continuous economic rise. The sticky power concept has been coined by Mead, and he mentioned about this sticky power from the economic power, and he used it when he criticized U.S. position why U.S. is not exercising economic power. But sticky power is a double-edged sword, and many countries want to develop economic ties with a stronger power like USA or China for trade and investment, and also for the technology. But at the same time, these economic ties bring kind of vulnerabilities of a given economy to big powers like to China. So I was interested in how this sticky power is transforming to soft power, more attraction, or the sharp power, more critical perspectives. And here, interestingly, over the last decade, there has been increasing criticism against rising Chinese influence. I think over the 10 or 15 years, I followed the literature on the reviewing Chinese ODA, mainly in African countries. And the Chinese ODA is different from the Western donors, because Chinese donors, usually they give the developing countries export credits, and also they are bringing all this investment to the extractive industries, like mining industries in African continent. And usually the Chinese donors bring Chinese labor rather than using the African labors. So there are quite a lot of criticism, and also Chinese ODA has been contributing to rising debt in many African countries, and also from the Western perspective. And they criticize because China is not concerned about the human rights and good governance, but Chinese help the many authoritarian regimes in African continents. So there has been criticism. Some people say China ODA is a rogue ODA, and recently, interestingly, of course, East Asia is different from Africa, because in East Asia there are more developed economies, and also the role of Japan and also South Korea is important. However, even in East Asia countries, there has been a kind of backlash about the Chinese economic plans. For example, as we all know, in 2015, the Sri Lanka government had to hand over Hambantota port for 1990 years because they couldn't pay back the ODA. And this summer in 2018, the Martyr, when he emerged as a prime minister again, he canceled the Chinese OBOR project, I think East Coast Railways, and also the oil pipeline project that was signed by his predecessor with the Chinese government. So there are some, more cautious approach because Chinese ODA is linked to the rising indebtedness and also vulnerability of national security of host countries. And if you go to the West, and of course, the America is the major, the critical countries toward China, and up to the, I would say, early 2000s, there was a kind of more positive evaluation of Chinese influence, and we all know 2004, Lamo's characterization of Beijing consensus in contrast to the Washington consensus. Even though Chinese themselves don't like this term, Beijing consensus, that was viewed as an alternative model of development. And we also remember 2007, the Kulandzik's charm offensive, how the China is using all these powers to increase the soft power. But interestingly, from the midpoint of 2010s, there is a kind of criticism against China. And for example, NED, National Endowment for Democracy, labeled China as a sharp power. And the Economist of December 2017 ran the special cover story about China's sharp power. And they say sharp power, if I quote, is subversion, bullying, and pressure, which combine to promote self-censorship. And this sharp power by China is leading to preemptive kowtowing by those who fear losing Chinese funding and access to Chinese market and influence. So from this, oh, that's too small to see, but you can see my paper. So my theme became then how the tide but threatened East Asian countries would respond to this recent great power, China. And I remember in 1999, Ian Johnson and his friends published a book called Engaging China, The Management of an Emerging Power. So I read that book very interestingly, and it was 1999, and 20 years passed. And over the last 20 years, the Chinese influence became much greater when compared to the point they published the book. So, okay, then I'm gonna check their hypothesis and their findings. And in that book, 1999 book, the IS scholar Schweller, so this is 6 policy options to revisionist rising power. And he said there are 3 risk-accepting, 2 risk-accepting the strategy. There's a preventive war, containment or balancing, and there are risk-averting strategy, that's engagement, binding, bandwagoning, and lastly, distancing or bypassing. And of course, most Asian countries would take a risk-averting strategy, even USA that can be very powerful. And in that book, they argued USA is taking more engagement, avoiding the war strategy. And here, all the authors of book chapters, they characterized South Korea and Singapore and taking maximal engagement strategies. And Malaysia and Indonesia are more skeptical about engagement with the different reasons. And Taiwan taking a minimal containment strategies, and Japan moving to a hedging strategy, encouraging trade and investment in China, while taking diplomatic efforts to gain favorable reception than China in the regional activities. Okay, so I was interested in checking how the strategies or managements of East Asian countries would have changed over almost 20 years. And of course, we need to be very careful because strategic management or strategies are usually formed by policy leads. So, but the data I'm gonna use is mass data, so ordinary people. So you may say there are gaps between the policy elites and the ordinary people. But nevertheless, the more a country is developed and democratizes, the popular perception matters. And so the data, Asia Barometer Wave 4 survey was done between June 2014 and January of 2016. And I think there are 14 countries among ASEAN. The Brunei and Laos are omitted. However, they of course added 3 Northeast Asian countries, South Korea, China, and Japan. And also they added Hong Kong and Taiwan. So I think there are 14 country data. So what they have found as first, all East Asian countries view Chinese influence on their own country as important. And an absolute majority, the lowest is 81% in the Philippines, and the highest 99% in Hong Kong. So absolute majority said Chinese influence is very important and very great. And except Japan and the Philippines, people in all countries viewed Chinese influence is stronger than the US influence. Okay, that is kind of unanimous. And number 2, however, when they evaluate the Chinese influence, there are variances. So we check the bilateral influence. How do you view the China's influence is good to your country or bad to your country? And also we ask Chinese influence in the region, so that's separate. So if you look at the bilateral influences, there is a grouping, so to speak. Japan, Taiwan, Mongolia, Myanmar, and Vietnam view Chinese influence rather negatively. For example, 8 out of 10 Japanese and Vietnamese thought China does more harm than good. On the other hand, only less than 4 out of 10 respondents in Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, and South Korea viewed China harming their country. So it means more positively, they view the Chinese influence to their own country more positively. And then if we go to the Chinese regional influence, similar patterns were found. So there are not much difference between the Chinese regional influence and Chinese bilateral influence. Again, respondents in Japan, Vietnam, Myanmar, Mongolia, and the Philippines are more likely to perceive China as a harmful power in the region. Their view on American regional influence is rather more positive. There is a kind of zero-sum relationships. And on the other hand, respondents in China, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Hong Kong think the American regional influence is more harmful than Chinese influence. Except for Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Mongolia, people in all countries surveyed viewed Chinese influence more negatively in a regional context than in a bilateral context. It's interesting, they regard Chinese influence, regional influence, more negatively than the bilateral influence. Okay, and obviously, we were interested in comparing the people's views toward China vis-a-vis people's view toward the USA. So we divided the 4 groups. The first group is positivists, regarding both Chinese and American influence positively. And the second group is skeptics of Chinese influence. The third group, skeptics of American influence. And the fourth group is skeptics of both powers. They don't like both, USA and China. And we found the pattern in Japan and Vietnam and Mongolia. There is a tendency of pro-US, anti-China views tend to be stronger. And in South Korea and Singapore and Thailand and Cambodia, pro-US, pro-China groups tend to be more dominant. And Indonesia and Malaysia, on the other hand, US skeptics were more prominent. So in Taiwan and Hong Kong, pro-China, pro-US groups comprise the biggest portion, with the China skeptics in Taiwan and US skeptics in Hong Kong as the second biggest group respectively. So, so there are kind of this four-group composition of each country when they compare Chinese and US influence toward their country and also toward to their region. Okay. All right, that was a brief review about what we have found in the East Asian the barometer survey. And naturally, I became interested in what kind of factors would affect to this different assessment of Chinese influences. Naturally, you look at, because of sticky power after all, and I checked the trade ties, whether the trade kind of dependence on China can make some difference. And then I was interested in checking also Chinese ODA and Chinese FDI to the Asian countries. And I found that William Mary, and they have very good data of gathering all the aid data and investment data. So I used that one. And for the trade data, I used the World Bank. And if you look at the World Bank data, I couldn't find any good pattern. And I listed up the country which have a negative view toward the Chinese influence to their own country, starting from Japan. 80% of Japanese are viewing Chinese influence negatively. And then I go to the order of Vietnam, Mongolia, and to the bottom, Thailand. Only 6.5% of Thailand people view Chinese influence to their own country very small. So this was the order. And then I checked from the World Bank portal data, percent of exports to China in their total export, and percent of imports from China in their total imports. And I'm sure the trade itself, the weight must be considered. So I checked the trade as a percentage of total GDP of each country. And if you look at the pattern, you see these numbers, there's no good pattern. For example, Mongolia, which is quite negative to China, 80% of export of Mongolia are going to Chinese market. And they import almost 1/3 of total imports from China. And the trade dependency is high, almost 100% of GDP. However, if you look at the Malaysia, of course, it's a quite similar pattern with Mongolia. And so it wasn't easy to find the pattern. So, okay, then forget about it. So I checked the next one is about ODA. But of course, the rich countries don't receive Chinese ODA, and so all this financial assistance, financial investment merged together. And then, so according to aid data, you have the third column, China's official finance between 2000 and 2016, and then official visit from Chinese elites, and students studying in China, a number of sister cities, and number of Confucius institutes. So that's more PD tools. And you can see that some pattern. For higher income countries like Japan, South Korea, and Singapore, Chinese use more exchange and cultural diplomacy, such as sister city ties and also building up Confucius Institute. And South Korea is rather unique because we are sending more than 70,000 students to China. It's very exceptional among comparing to other countries. And for Malaysia and Indonesia, China focused on financial assistance. So I can see some pattern, but of course there is a very difficult to set up the causal relationship. how the Chinese public diplomacy tools would affect the peoples of these countries' assessment toward Chinese influence. So then I moved to another factor the Americans like, that's democracy factors. We expect the liberal value holders tend to be more critical toward China because China is not democracy, it's a very strong authoritarian state. So the hypothesis was that the more you have liberal values, you will assess Chinese influence negatively. And fortunately, in ABS, there are 9 questions to measure liberal values: political efficacy, individual rights, limits of government power, and globalizations, and so forth. So we divide up the group using the mean number, the higher liberal value holders versus low liberal value holders. But and we found consistently, with the exception of Mongolia, in all countries, people with higher liberal values tend to embrace more negative views on Chinese influence in their country. This tendency is particularly strong in Taiwan and Myanmar. So you can see this graph looking at the democratic values and perceived Chinese influence to their own country. So it seems to be a matter of the democracy factors. But interestingly, we checked the democracy factors, whether they can lead to more pro-American attitude. That wasn't true. When we look at the data, we should not expect the possessing liberal values necessarily leads to pro-American views. For example, the higher value, liberal value holders in Japan, South Korea, and Thailand view American influence in their countries more negatively than lower liberal value holders. This was interesting. And then, on the contrary, we checked illiberal countries like China itself, and Hong Kong and Myanmar, and also Cambodia. And here, the liberal value holders tend to be more favorable to USA. So ironically, liberals in less free countries seem to more readily take the side of US over China, while this tendency is not true among the liberals in flourishing democracies such as Japan and South Korea. So you can see, and to make sure, we checked the regression data, but I didn't put the PPT here. You can see regression data in my paper, but not much difference. So for what? So what? So my discussion point is that from this data analysis, we can conclude that I'm trying to link the data analysis to each East Asian country's managing strategy. And we can say Japan has a popular base for moving toward more balancing strategy toward China. And of course, the policy elites of Japan doesn't necessarily have to, but they have a kind of public opinion support to take a more balancing strategy. And if you look at the South Korea and Singapore, they seem to remain as a maximum engager of China in the region, as the Ian Johnston and others have revealed in 1999. Maybe Singapore, 3 out of 4 Singaporeans are after all Chinese. This ethnic background may explain why Singapore is actively engaging with China. And if you look at South Korea, and of course South Korea expects Chinese role in the peninsula issues, and also future reunification, and also South Korea doesn't regard China as a kind of a security threat, despite we have a very strong alliance relationship with the USA. So, all these reasons are contributing to South Korea to take a more active engagement strategy toward China. And even though the Japan and South Korea are saying very strong U.S. allies, well, we differ quite differently in engaging China. On the contrary, to the observation made in the late 1990s, Malaysia and Thailand have turned to China over the USA. I don't know the reason. Chinese financial assistance surely have contributed to this change. At the same time, maybe the democratic setbacks in these countries, the coup d'etat in Thailand and Malaysia was reversing their democracies until recently. So when there is a democratic backlash, we see America is less engaging. But when Myanmar is opening, America rushed to Myanmar. So maybe if I advise the USA, it's not a good idea. If a country is, the democratic quality of a democracy is declining, don't leave the country, then your influence will be diminished further. And for China's side, I would say, China, you have a great power, sticky power, but if you want your sticky power to translate into more positive, constructive soft power, China needs to heed both the region-wide and the country-specific concern about their perception toward strong Chinese influence. I stop here.